Jerry, listening on WCRV, Nashville, Tennessee. Hi, Jerry.
My question involves a friend of mine. I've been having discussions with him about the lost gospel, the Gospel of Thomas, and the writings by a man named Joseph Campbell.
Mm-hmm.
I just don't know how to respond to him anymore.
Yeah, well, I think one of the things that you want to do is demonstrate that the Bible is historic and evidential. It's never blind faith, but it's always faith and evidence, which is to say, we believe the Bible to be an authority because it is demonstrably true. You can see that through the manuscript evidence, which is incredible, because you can demonstrate that God has miraculously preserved his word over time by the manuscripts. The New Testament alone has almost 6,000 manuscripts. Now, all the manuscripts have errors, but they don't all have the same errors, and therefore by analyzing one manuscript in light of another, you can get back to the original. And what's beautiful about the biblical manuscripts is that they were written in relative close proximity to the original writings, and the original writings in close proximity to the actual events that they chronicle. So there's no time for legendary contamination. That is not true with respect to the Gospel of Thomas. If you look closely at the Gospel of Thomas, what you'll find is that it was deeply impacted by the Gnostic practices that arose long after the advent of Christianity. So the Gospel of Thomas is late, and by virtue of that alone, it's not reliable. But when you read through some of these lost Gospels, you see immediately, even if you're not a literary expert, the difference between a Gospel like the Gospel of Mary Magdalene or the Gospel of Judas or the Gospel of Thomas and something like the Gospel of John. Here's an example from the Gospel of Thomas. You might want to use this one with your friends. This is a conversation in the Gospel of Thomas between Peter and Jesus, at least an alleged conversation between the two, in which Simon Peter says, "Make Mary leave us. Females don't deserve life." Now let me stop there for a moment. In a biblical worldview, women were considered completely equal to men. In fact, Jesus had disciples who were women, part of his inner circle.
Yes.
Women were the first to testify to his resurrection. We have apostles who are women. We have Bible teachers who are women. We have music leaders who are women in the Bible. So women are highly esteemed, and that in a culture in which women were generally considered to be the property of men. So Jesus comes into that context, and the gospel writers with him, and they elevate women to their rightful status on complete level with men. But not so in the Gospel of Thomas, where Simon Peter says, "Make Mary leave us, for females don't deserve life." And Jesus says, look, here's how I'm going to solve the problem. I'm going to guide her and make her a male so that she too may become a living spirit resembling a male. For every female who makes herself male will enter the domain of heaven. How different an ethic that is communicating than what you have in the Synoptic Gospels in John.
How is that supposed to happen?
Beg pardon?
How is he supposed to make a woman male?
Well, that's a good question, but the Gnostics didn't traffic in history and evidence, but rather in esoteric and syncretistic beliefs and practices. So it's a wholly different worldview and notion that's very esoteric, and at the end of the day doesn't correspond to that which corresponds to reality. In other words, simply not true. And that's the same thing with Joseph Campbell. He was the best-selling author of The Power of Myth.
Yeah.
His mystical worldview led him to take the truth of the resurrection and turn it into mythology. Now, why do you and I believe in the resurrection? Well, we believe in the resurrection because we can demonstrate or present a cumulative case for the reality that Jesus rose from the dead. Christianity cannot survive an identifiable tomb containing the corpse of Christ. But what he does is he takes the resurrection and turns it into mythology. He says there's no such thing as absolute truth, no such thing as moral absolutes. In other words, I'm not right to tell you, do not murder, because there's no such thing as a moral absolute. That's a dangerous person to follow right at that juncture. He says that beliefs are based on feelings. No, the Christian faith holds to all kinds of beliefs that are not based on feelings, but rather observable facts. He says that the Western civilization that we embrace today is the root of all evil, which is absurd. I mean, going back to women, think about this. If you go back to Greeks and their mythology, or the Roman practices which were forged on the anvil of classical Greek thinking, what do you have? You have men who are created as brutes so that they can serve other men. You have gods controlling the world on the basis of their moods. You have women who are not equal to men. In fact, you could allow in Roman civilization a female baby to expire in front of the statue of Nero with all her cries, because after all, she was just a female. Western civilization changes all of that, because in Western civilization, a man cannot put away a woman. A man has to love and cherish a woman above himself. And therefore, in marriage, a woman was exalted to an extremely high position, such that they could no longer be considered chattel, they had to be considered equal. And as a result of that, Western women became the most powerful women of any civilization at any time. And now with the devolution of Western civilization, where we're going back to classical Greek thinking, women are once again walking into shackles under the guise of being liberated. So you can go to Hugh Hefner's harem in the interest of thinking in your warped mind that somehow or other you're being liberated. But Joseph Campbell thought Western civilization was the root of all evil. No, Western civilization created all the things that are beneficial to humankind that we are still experiencing today, even though we live in the shadow of the Bible on which Western civilization was based. He said that religion is part of the evolutionary process. He said that the Bible can't be trusted. He said that evolution was true, although in reality evolution is at best a low-grade hypothesis. And at its core is about inequality, not about equality, because in evolution it is just as important that the unfit die as that the fittest survive. Because if the unfit would survive indefinitely, they would infect the fit with their less fit genes, and evolution wouldn't work. So what anyone who adheres to the lost gospels or Joseph Campbell is doing is going back to the Dark Ages. You know, the whole idea of Dark Ages was mythology created to say that after the fall of Rome, we entered these Dark Ages until the Italian Renaissance or the Enlightenment. This was a myth produced as an anti-Christian sentiment. The reality is, going back to these ways and thinking that I just described, that's really the Dark Ages. Christianity brought enlightenment. In fact, it was as a result of Christianity that said, reason is not alone. Reason must always be augmented by revelation, because if it isn't, we end up in the blind ditch of ignorance. So the bottom line in breaking through this is to demonstrate, no, your faith is not blind faith, it's always faith in evidence. you have evidence to believe that God created the universe, that Jesus Christ is God, and that the Bible is divine as opposed to merely human in origin. And that's where you always want to start, and quite frankly, where you always want to stay.